Ever feel like you're really putting in the work at the gym? Like you're giving it your all, but when you look in the mirror, the gains just aren't showing up.
Yeah, I hear that. It's a really common problem. And it can be super frustrating when you're putting in the time and effort, but not seeing the results you want.
Totally. It's like, what's the point of all this sweat and soreness if you're not actually building any noticeable muscle, right?
Right. And the advice you often hear, like, just train harder or eat more, it doesn't always seem to cut it for a lot of people.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're going to try to understand why so much of the typical weight training advice out there just doesn't seem to work for the average person. The ones who aren't genetic freaks, or let's face it, using steroids.
Yeah, the so-called hard gainers.
Exactly. And we're going to look specifically at some really interesting ideas from these Iron Addict excerpts.
Oh yeah, these excerpts are packed with some unconventional but surprisingly effective insights.
Definitely. It's kind of like a shortcut to understanding why your past efforts might not have paid off, and more importantly, what you can actually do differently to finally start seeing those gains you've been working for.
The aim here is to really cut through all the noise and hype in the fitness world and distill the essential principles for building muscle, specifically for folks who find it a real struggle.
Yeah, because it can be overwhelming out there, right? There's so much information, and it's hard to know what to trust.
Totally. So we're aiming to give you some clear, actionable insights that you can actually put to use right away.
Awesome. So one of the first things that jumps out from our sources is this whole idea that one-size-fits-all training advice is basically a myth.
It's a huge myth. The problem is that so much of the standard weight training knowledge you see in magazines and online, it's often designed for a very specific type of person.
Yeah, like those guys who seem to pack on muscle just by looking at a barbell.
Exactly.
Yeah,
The genetically gifted. And let's be honest, a lot of those guys are using performance-enhancing drugs too.
for sure. The Iron Addict excerpts actually call it out pretty directly. They talk about this extreme overabundance of information that is entirely unsuitable for the vast majority.
Yeah, and it's like the fitness industry kind of forgets about the rest of us, you know? The people who have to work a bit harder to see results.
It can be pretty discouraging, right? You see all these incredible physiques and you think, if I just follow their workout, I'll look like that too. But it doesn't quite work that way.
Not at all. It's like assuming you can become a concert pianist just by banging on the keys really hard because you watch someone who's been playing for years do it effortlessly.
That's a great analogy. The Iron Addict author also has this great analogy about jumping out of a plane without a parachute.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
They ask, would you ever jump out of a plane without a parachute? And of course you wouldn't. But then they reveal that the plane is actually parked on the ground.
Okay, that's a clever way to make a point.
Right. It's all about challenging our assumptions and being open to new ideas, even if they seem a bit counterintuitive at first.
Totally. So that brings us to this concept of the hard gainer.
Yeah, so the Iron Addict excerpts introduce us to Stuart McRobert and his publication, Hardgainer, as a really valuable source of information for people who struggle to build muscle.
Hard Gainer magazine.
Right. And they define a hard gainer as someone who doesn't see much progress from most training programs.
And importantly, they also don't see other people around them making consistent progress naturally.
Yeah, that's key. It's not just about you. It's about noticing that other people in the gym who aren't using drugs aren't really making those consistent gains either.
Does that ring a bell for anyone listening?
Hopefully not too loudly.
Well, if it does, you're not alone.
Not at all. And you know, what's interesting is that the author shares a personal anecdote about their early training days in the Army, where they were actually making better progress when their workouts were inconsistent.
Really? How so?
Well, they were aiming for a full-body workout 3 times a week, but ended up training sporadically. Sometimes there were 5 to 10 days between sessions.
So basically, they were taking more rest days than they planned.
Exactly. And what's crazy is that they actually saw better gains during that period of inconsistency.
That's wild. So it kind of goes against the whole no pain, no gain mentality,
Yeah, it really highlights this crucial principle of avoiding overtraining.
which we'll talk about more in a bit. But the main takeaway here is that while you can change your genetics, you can absolutely unlock your potential by using the right training methodology.
Absolutely. It's all about working with your body, not against it.
Okay, so let's talk about overtraining. It's kind of ironic that the reason many people aren't seeing gains is that they're actually training too much.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, right? But it's true. The Iron Addict excerpts are very clear on this. They say that for the average person, the primary reason for a lack of progress is overtraining, not undertraining.
And I think part of the problem is that we see these pro bodybuilders doing these insane high-volume workouts, and we assume that's what we need to do to build muscle.
But those guys are in a completely different category. They're often genetically gifted and, more often than not, using performance-enhancing drugs. Their bodies can handle a level of training that would just crush the average person.
It's like comparing a Ferrari to a Honda Civic. They're built for different purposes, and they require different levels of maintenance.
Exactly. So for most people, the key is to find that sweet spot where you're training enough to stimulate muscle growth, but not so much that you're constantly breaking your body down without giving it a chance to recover.
So recovery is crucial, right?
It's absolutely fundamental. The excerpts emphasize that your body doesn't just need to recover from a workout, it needs time and resources to adapt and grow after that recovery period.
Think of it like this. When you train, you're essentially creating tiny tears in your muscle fibers.
Right, and it's during rest that your body repairs those tears and builds them back stronger and bigger.
So if you're constantly hitting the gym and not giving your body enough time to recover, you're essentially just breaking yourself down without ever allowing for real growth.
It's like trying to build a house while simultaneously demolishing parts of it.
You end up in this frustrating cycle of depletion and stagnation, where you're constantly tired and sore, but you're not seeing any real progress.
Exactly. You're spinning your wheels without actually moving forward.
So what's the solution?
The solution, which the Iron Addict excerpts call shocking to many, is prioritizing recovery.
Shocking. Really?
Yeah, because it goes against the more is always better mentality that's so prevalent in the fitness world.
So basically, doing less can actually lead to more gains.
Absolutely. It's about finding that sweet spot where you're stimulating growth without overdoing it. And the best way to know if you're recovering adequately is to pay close attention to your strength levels.
Okay, so how do we know if we're recovering enough? What's the key sign to look for?
The Iron Addict material says it best. If you are not using progressively heavier poundages in all your lifts on a consistent basis, every other detail is irrelevant.
Basically, if you're not getting stronger, you're not growing.
Exactly. That's the real sign of progress. Forget about chasing the pump or feeling the burn. Your primary goal should be to lift heavier weights over time.
Okay, so concretely, what does that look like?
Well, they give some good guidelines. For smaller exercises, you might aim to add 1/2 pound to 2 pounds each week. For larger compound movements, you might aim for 1 to 5 pounds.
Okay, that doesn't sound like a lot.
It might not seem like much, but it adds up over time. They give the example of adding just 1 pound to your bench press each week. If you can do that consistently, that's a 50-pound increase over a year.
Wow, that puts it into perspective.
Right. It's all about those small, consistent wins that add up over the long haul.
So patience is key.
Definitely. And realistic expectations. Especially in the beginning, you might see faster gains, but as you get more experience, the gains naturally slow down.
But the key is to keep pushing for those small, consistent increases in strength.
Exactly. So speaking of strength, let's talk about exercise selection. Our source puts a huge emphasis on what they call the driver, which is heavy compound movements.
Yeah, the big lifts like squats and deadlifts.
Exactly. They argue that those exercises are absolutely essential for overall muscle growth, especially for hard gainers.
And why is that?
Well, for one thing, they engage a massive amount of muscle mass. They estimate that a squat or deadlift works about 70% of your entire musculature.
70%. That's a lot.
Compared to like 10% for an isolation exercise, like a bicep curl or tricep extension.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So basically, compound movements send a much stronger signal to your body to adapt and grow.
Exactly. The metabolic demand and the overall systemic effect of those exercises are just way greater than isolation work.
So we're talking about squats, deadlifts, what else?
They also talk about the history of the 20-rep squat routine.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. That's the one where you basically do 20 reps of squats with a weight that you can usually only do for like 15, right?
You got it. It's brutal, but super effective, especially for hard gainers. You do sets of 20, even if you have to take short rest periods within the set to get there.
That sounds tough.
It is, but it's a great way to really challenge yourself and stimulate muscle growth. They also talk about the deadlift, both conventional and sumo, and how it can be equally or even more effective than squatting for some people.
Especially for taller folks, right?
Yeah, exactly. They even talk about the trap bar deadlift and how it can be a great option for people who have trouble with the conventional deadlift.
Yeah, the trap bar is super versatile.
Yeah.
And it can be a bit easier on the lower back.
Definitely. And they emphasize that high reps aren't the only way to go. You can build muscle with rep ranges anywhere from 5 to 20. The key is to train with enough intensity.
And intensity means training close to failure.
Right. But they do recommend trying a dedicated cycle of 20-rep squats or deadlifts for 8 to 16 weeks to experience the unique benefits.
So what about people who can't do squats or deadlifts for whatever reason? Maybe they have an injury or some kind of physical limitation, or are they just out of luck?
Not necessarily. They recommend seeking out qualified instruction to make sure you have proper form.
Okay, so maybe they need to work on their technique.
Yeah, or maybe they need to work on their mobility. They also suggest the safety squat bar as a great tool for people who have trouble with the regular squat.
Especially for taller folks, right?
Exactly. And as a last resort, they mention the leg press machine. But they really emphasize that it shouldn't be used as an excuse to avoid learning to squat or deadlift if you can.
Makes sense.
Okay, so we've talked about the big lifts, the importance of progressive overload. Let's circle back to volume and frequency. You mentioned the dangers of overtraining earlier. What are their specific recommendations for optimizing these variables?
Right, so the author shares a personal anecdote about hitting a plateau while squatting twice a week.
Yeah, I remember that part.
And then they saw significant progress when they reduced the frequency to once a week for all their major lifts.
Really?
Yeah. And the key takeaway there is that consistent progress, meaning adding weight or reps each week, is the best indicator that your body is recovering properly and that your training volume and frequency are appropriate.
So if you're not seeing consistent progress, you're probably doing too much.
Exactly. It's all about listening to your body and making adjustments as needed.
They even mention a guy named Jack Stocks who was making good gains by doing just 2 exercises on separate days.
Wow, that's a pretty minimalist approach.
Yeah, it shows that you don't need to be in the gym all the time to build muscle.
And they also talk about this concept of exercise overlap.
Yeah, it's this idea that you want to minimize the number of exercises you do that work the same muscle groups.
Makes sense. If you're constantly hitting the same muscles, they're never going to have a chance to fully recover.
Exactly. So they recommend aiming to work each major muscle group or lift only once a week or even less frequently if you're prone to overtraining.
Okay, so we're talking about spreading out our training volume
Yeah.
and giving our bodies adequate time to recover.
Yep. And they have this great quote, "You don't grow in the gym, you grow when you're resting between workouts."
That's a good one.
Right. So make sure you're getting enough rest. It's just as important as the training itself.
So what about when you hit a plateau? You're doing everything right, you're recovering well, but your progress stalls. What do you do then?
Well, they outline 4 basic methods for breaking through plateaus.
Lay them on me.
First, intensity cycling.
That's where you vary the weight you lift over time.
Exactly. You might spend a few weeks gradually increasing the weight, and then you cycle back to slightly lighter weights to give your body a break and then build back up again.
So it's like planned periods of pushing harder and then easing back a bit.
Yeah, it prevents your body from adapting to a specific level of stress and keeps things moving forward.
Cool. What's the second method?
Adding rest days.
So basically taking more time off.
Yeah, as you get bigger and stronger, your body might need more time to recover. So you might add an extra rest day or 2, or even just train when you feel fully recovered, regardless of the calendar.
Okay, that makes sense. I think a lot of people worry about losing progress if they take too much time off, though.
Right, but they address that concern. They say that taking longer rest periods won't make you lose muscle.
Good to know. What's the third method?
Reducing training volume.
So doing fewer exercises or sets.
Yep. You might even experiment with doing just 1 work set to failure for each exercise.
Whoa, that's pretty hardcore.
It can be.
Yeah.
But the idea is to really focus on quality over quantity,
And the fourth method.
changing the makeup of your routine.
So switching up the exercises.
Yeah. You might swap out your primary exercises for similar variations or adjust your rep ranges or rest periods. The key is to keep things fresh and prevent your body from getting too used to the same routine.
Got it. So those are some solid strategies for breaking through plateaus. Now let's talk about exercise selection again. They have some interesting things to say about arm training for hard gainers.
Yeah, they actually advise against doing any direct arm work at first.
Really, that seems counterintuitive.
It does, but their logic is that hard gainers are already prone to overtraining, so they should focus on the most efficient exercises first.
And those.
Compound movements like weighted chins and dips.
Okay, so instead of doing bicep curls and tricep extensions, you're saying they should be doing chins and dips.
Exactly. The idea is that those compound movements will build a strong foundation, and your arms will grow naturally as you get stronger.
They even give specific strength targets for those exercises as indicators of arm development.
Yeah, like being able to do chin-ups with a significant amount of added weight or dips with extra weight. Once you reach those milestones, you'll definitely have some noticeable arm size.
So basically build the foundation first, and the smaller muscle groups will follow.
Precisely. Now, we also touched on this idea of doing just one set to failure earlier.
Right, let's dive a bit deeper into that.
They list 3 main benefits of one-set training. First, improved recovery.
Because you're doing less volume overall.
Exactly. Second, potentially greater effort.
Because you know you only have one set to give it your all.
Right. And third, more exercise variety.
Because you can fit in more exercises within a lower volume framework.
Makes sense. But they also caution that there are some potential downsides. The biggest one is the risk of not putting in enough effort.
Yeah, if you're not truly going all out on that one set, you're probably not going to stimulate much growth.
Right. And they also acknowledge that one-set training might not be ideal for building maximum strength in very low rep ranges.
Okay, so it might not be for everyone.
Right. And they also point out that you might get some funny looks from people in the gym who think you're not training hard enough.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
But their main point is that the best results come from finding the minimal amount of training that works for you.
It's all about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. And they stress that if you're going to do one-set training, you have to really commit to pushing yourself to absolute failure on that one set.
Meaning you physically can't do another rep.
No question.
Yeah.
Now, beyond training, they also emphasize the importance of other factors that are crucial for hard gainers.
Like diet.
Yes. Diet is huge. They emphasize the importance of tracking your calories, protein, carbs, and fat.
So basically knowing what you're putting into your body.
Exactly. They also talk about the importance of adequate protein intake.
Which is essential for building muscle.
Right. They even suggest that some people might need to supplement to hit their protein targets.
Makes sense.
And they emphasize that with training, less is often more, but with nutrition, more is generally better.
Okay, so eat plenty of nutrient-dense foods.
Yep. And don't be afraid to use supplements strategically. They also recommend things like protein powder, carb and protein blends for post-workout, and a multivitamin.
So cover your bases.
Exactly. They also reiterate the importance of training for strength, keeping a detailed training diary, and prioritizing safety.
All important stuff.
And finally, they stress the importance of accepting your genetic limitations and comparing your progress to yourself, not to others.
That's a good one. It's easy to get caught up in comparing yourself to other people, but that's a recipe for frustration.
For sure. Focus on your own journey and celebrate your own wins.
Okay, we've covered a lot. Now let's talk about training intensity and rep speed. They have some interesting insights on those topics as well.
Yeah. They actually break down intensity into 3 levels: regular training, training to failure, and beyond failure training.
Okay, let's start with regular training. What's that all about?
Well, it's basically training where you don't push yourself to the point where you can't do another rep.
So you're leaving a few reps in the tank.
Exactly. They say that this is the most common approach, but it's often not enough to stimulate growth for hard gainers, especially when combined with high volume.
Okay, so what about training to failure?
This is where you push yourself until you physically can't do another rep with good form.
You're completely spent.
Yep. They emphasize that this is essential for hard gainers who are training with lower volumes.
Got it. And what about beyond failure training?
This is where you use techniques like forced reps, static contractions, supersets, rest pause, and drop sets to push yourself even further.
Okay, so those are more advanced techniques.
They are. And they recommend using them sparingly, if at all, for hard gainers.
Why is that?
Because they can easily lead to overtraining if you're not careful. They do highlight rest pause as a potentially useful technique, though.
That's the one where you take short breaks during a set, right?
Exactly. It allows you to squeeze out a few more reps with a heavy weight.
Got it. Now, what about rep speed? How fast or slow should you be lifting the weights?
That's a great question. They talk about the importance of the eccentric or lowering phase of the lift and the concept of time under tension.
Time under tension, what's that?
It's the amount of time that your muscles are under strain during a set.
So basically, how long you're holding the weight and working against the resistance.
Exactly. They say that slower, controlled reps are generally better for muscle growth than fast, uncontrolled reps.
Interesting. So don't just throw the weight around.
Right. They recommend a tempo of around 2 seconds for the lifting phase and 2 seconds for the lowering phase.
Okay, so a nice controlled tempo.
Yep. And they emphasize that the eccentric or lowering phase is particularly important for muscle growth.
So don't neglect that part of the lift.
Absolutely. They also mention that techniques like rest pause and drop sets can increase time under tension as well.
Okay, so those techniques aren't just about pushing yourself harder. They're also about manipulating time under tension to maximize muscle growth.
Exactly. Well, that was a lot of information. I hope it was helpful.
It's incredibly insightful. Let's recap some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
All right, so for hard gainers, the main things to remember are prioritize recovery by training with a lower volume and frequency than you might think. Focus on getting consistently stronger in the big compound lifts like squats, deadlifts, chins, and dips. Pay close attention to how your body responds to your training and make adjustments as needed.
And most importantly, be wary of generic training advice that's not tailored to your specific needs and limitations.
Exactly. Don't try to train like a pro bodybuilder if you're not a pro bodybuilder.
So, with all of that in mind, what's one small change you could make to your training routine that aligns with these principles? Could that seemingly minor tweak be the key to finally unlocking the gains you've been working for? And if you really think about your own training history, could the answer actually be doing less to achieve more? Food for thought, right?
Absolutely.
We encourage you to revisit your training plan with a critical eye, armed with these new insights. And if you want to dive even deeper into this stuff, definitely check out Hardgainer magazine and some of the books we've mentioned. Thanks for listening, and keep pushing for those gains.
Keep pushing.
See you next time.
See ya.